Morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Thank you so much for being among the hardy, the few, the proud, and the participating. My name is Eric Liu. I am the founder and CEO of Citizen University, and I also run a program here at the Aspen Institute on citizenship and American identity. And really glad to invite you here into this conversation today. And it will be a conversation that begins for the first stretch with my friend Jonathan Holloway, the Dean of Yale College, and then we hope just to include everybody here with questions or observations as we go. I want to provide just a little bit of context for this conversation. Jonathan has been Dean of Yale College for how many years now? 2 years, but long-time presence and part of the Yale community before that, both as a member of the faculty and previously as what was then called the master of what is still called Calhoun College at Yale, one of the residential halls that's been at the heart of some of the campus debates and protests over the last year. And our aim today is to talk less about those protests and what's gone on campus, and more kind of from a bigger picture view, using that perhaps as one data point, how institutions of higher education, colleges, undergraduate colleges in particular, can and must be forming and shaping capacities for civic leadership. And the reason why we're having this conversation is that Jonathan and I have been not only thinking and talking about this, we've been trying our best to practice it on the campus of Yale. So about 2 years ago, we decided to put together a new initiative on the campus for undergraduates on civic leadership. And we've been including a range of students and other members of the Yale community in that endeavor. And we'll tell you a little bit more about that. But the learning that we've had from creating this project has been tremendous, and having this project unfold at precisely the same time that there's been this, in my view, but easy for me to say because I'm at somewhat of a distance, this interesting and sometimes very inspiring wave of student activism has made the project doubly rich. And throughout, both in what we've been doing together on the campus to create this initiative and projects of learning and skill development for these students, but also in the ways that Jonathan has had to navigate the crises on campus having to do with race and inclusion and the culture of Yale College. I want to tell you, for those of you who don't either know Jonathan, follow Yale College, or even have followed these issues generally super closely, that we're in the presence of one of the most ethical civic leaders in higher education in the United States, and somebody who brings to this work not only the kind of combination of head and heart that you'd want in a role like the Dean of Yale College during times of great ferment, but brings a sense of humility and something that I think is often, ironically, lacking in higher education leadership, and that is a true beginner's mind and a learner's spirit, as he's been navigating and learning. And so I just want to crack things open by saying how delighted I am to have Jonathan here at Aspen, and maybe just start this conversation, Jonathan, with a question about how, when you think about when you first came on board as Dean of Yale College, and there's a panoply of things that you had to both worry about and get excited about trying to make happen. What was it? What was the kind of germ for you of a notion that there ought to be more on this notion of leadership in general, but particularly civic leadership, leading in civic life, leading in public in roles that are about serving society?
Well, first I want to say that I'm thrilled to be here. This is my first time at Aspen, and I've learned in the 16 hours I've been on the campus that Eric Liu's a rock star. Everywhere I go, you know Eric Liu? And so this has been very special. This is very special. So let me provide a bit of background to answer that question about how did I get to this point of prioritizing civic leadership. Eric mentioned I'd been the master of Calhoun College, one of Yale's 12 residential colleges. There's soon to be 2 more opening up in a year's time. And I had been in that role for 8 years. The beauty of the residential college system is that you have at Yale all the benefits of a large research university, but also the anonymity that comes with that. But then the college separates or creates another layer of intimacy. Whereas the master of the college, I interacted with 420 odd Yale students. Now this is really important because I learned, the job description when I took it, which was very short, was the master sets the moral and intellectual tone of the college, which are very nice sounding words, but didn't really, how does that happen? I don't really know. And what I discovered when my family moved in, our children were 5.5 and 2.5 at the time, is that by being present, by engaging students sort of where they are, creating boundaries and expectations, and a lot of this was driven by the fact that I had a young family, that to my astonishment, I was able to set the terms upon which the community my children lived in existed. Every parent would love to have that sort of opportunity. But that was within one little residential college. When I became dean, all the residential colleges now report up to me, and the intimacy that you have as a master, or now college head, you don't have as the dean. You know, you're a figurehead. So I didn't know how to translate that community feeling of where we are all on the same page. We can disagree all we want, but we know we're going to have each other's back. How does that translate into an anonymous environment? So when I became the dean, and I was asked often what my vision for Yale College was, my first notion was not to break the thing. It's a beautiful place. I don't want to ruin it. And the second was, I've got to find a way, if it's possible, to build in a sense of community within Yale College I had in Calhoun. Well, the president called me on the phone, I think within a month of becoming the dean, and Eric and the president had been on the phone with each other. And Peter Holloway, the president, you need to talk with this alum, Eric Liu. And that began this great friendship. Within 5 minutes, I realized this was someone with whom I could partner, who already understood the building blocks of civic leadership and civic engagement. And he could help me broadcast what I've been able to develop in Calhoun to the larger community. Now, I'm a historian of post-emancipation United States history, and I focus a lot on political history and political culture. And so much of the African-American experience, which is what I specialize in, has been about a quest for, an insistence upon, full citizenship rights. So this is on my mind often. And given my experiences in Calhoun, my own sense of scholarship and pedagogy, and then this alum who I was introduced to, who was passionate about a lot of these same issues and had experience, well, it just seemed like this is a great way to start. So that's the genesis of it all. That's a bit longer context than you probably asked for. But frankly, not just on our campuses, but in our society, it's been apparent to me for quite a while, because of the stuff I study, we need to follow through on we need to have our reality match our ideals. And they just don't. And the opportunity to aspire towards that value as the Dean of Yale College, teaching, leading 5,500 students at a time who will have the chance to make a huge impact after they leave, that's worth thinking about and working towards.
You know, that gap that you just described between our ideals and our practice, you can look at it pretty much every fractal scale, right? I mean, the scale of a small community like Calhoun College when you were the master of that, the scale of a larger institution like Yale College, and of course the scale of the United States. And at every level there's some either spoken or unspoken creed that people like to cite or name or imagine themselves living up to, and then there's what's happening, right? And you know, as you think about this wider endeavor right now, we're at a time where all across society there's this incredible, again, ferment and upheaval, right? This and it runs the gamut from people who are supporting Bernie Sanders to people who are supporting Donald Trump, to Black Lives Matter activists, to the Tea Party, to $15 Now, Dreamers. You have all these people right now who are from the bottom up saying our received notions of what is okay, including our tolerance for that gap between ideals and institutions, we're no longer going to tolerate, right? And so in many ways, our endeavor right now of trying to foster civic leadership on campus is not happening during, quote, normal times, right? It's happening not only because of things that you've seen on campus, but it's in our society and around the world right now, the sense that we get to overturn lots of inherited hierarchies and inherited frameworks of thought. And I'm curious for you, I mean, how much in times like this you've had to try to strike that balance between, hey, if you want to become an effective leader in civic life, in talking to some of the students, including those who have come to protest you, you've got to learn both to be literate in the system as it is and to challenge it and perhaps try to upend it, right? And sometimes people want to hear only one side of that. How have you communicated these things?
Well, it's interesting. My communication of it has mainly come through listening, which is, it doesn't sound logical, but what I've experienced on Yale's campus this year was deep sense of either outrage, disappointment, and other things along that kind of emotional spectrum. But what people needed most of all was to be heard. I mean, the sense of hopelessness that people develop is because they feel there's no point. You know, no one's going to listen to me. No one has listened to me. The system is rigged. You know, you can think of all these kinds of phrases that speak to the Trump phenomenon, the Sanders phenomenon, everything you mentioned. It's like there's no point of playing by the rules. Even the rules are corrupt. They're never going to listen to me. Now, I was literally surrounded by students on one occasion, listening for 3 hours, about 250 students. Listening, I don't mean to suggest that one needs to listen to co-opt, because that is one way to think about it, is to bleed off the energy. No, listening so the person who's listening can learn what's actually going on the ground and to find ways to be responsive. I mean, the fact is, this year has been quite an education, nationally, internationally, nationally, and locally for me. The ground upon which we had been standing for a long time shifted. And sometimes the shift was very fast and violent. Other times it was more subtle, you didn't quite notice it. But it shifted. And if we don't listen to the people, we're in the way.
So as you, I mean, first of all, I think the incident that Jonathan refers to was incredibly memorable and to me moving.
I'll always remember it. That's
where there was a protest emerging on campus with a couple hundred students, and Jonathan literally waded into the middle of it, and the students surrounded him, and in ways passionate, sometimes emotional. Sometimes angry, sometimes hopeful, gave you their peace of mind.
Yes,
and Jonathan, for several hours, stood in the center of this circle, out on what's called cross campus, right? Actually, right by the gorgeous piece of public art, the women's table that Maya Lin made there to commemorate the coeducation of Yale in 1969. And he stood there for several hours listening. And I think that dimension of leadership cannot be, overstated. But I'm curious, as you've been listening, not only in a setting like that, but just throughout, what do you feel like the students at Yale, particularly those who've been catalytic in some of these protests and challenges, what do you feel like the students have learned about being leaders, catalytic leaders in civic life? What do you see them learning? Put away the part that's you're on the hot seat and they're coming at you, and now just in your kind of realm.
They learned how to do that.
They learned how to do that, yeah. But as an educator, what do you feel like they have learned?
Yeah. Well, I think they learned a number of things. One, that they actually had more resources within themselves, more power to create change than they expected. It's one thing if you expect you to run straight forward towards a wall and keep hitting that wall, breaks your spirit. But to realize that the wall eventually is going to give, to learn that you have that power to make that wall move is transformative. Now, the trick to it all is, at what point do you move from, and I don't say this it sounds denigrating, I really don't mean it this way. At what point do you move from a protest that is theatrical, public display, to, okay, now we need to roll up our sleeves and do the constructive work by, in Yale's case, engaging the administration. There needs to be a leap of faith, I think, and students have been wrestling with this. To what extent do they make a leap of faith to join in the administration to create the change that they want to see happen? I really hope they make that leap, because if they don't, the fact is there is a generation divide. There's an experiential divide. There are things the students have clamored for that I don't understand, try as I might. Other things I totally understand. So we need this, I want the students to learn that they need to be able to tap their energy and use it in building ways, constructing ways, to be part of the answer. They've also learned, certainly, how to become better protesters. And this, we went from October, November of spontaneous protest, essentially, and socially mediated protest. And one of the knocks prior to the last year that people who are my generation, Eric's very savvy with social media, I'm not. People who are like me, who are Luddite-ish when it comes to these things, would look at social media protests and like, well, it's not doing anything. Well, 2015 proved that wrong. So the students learned how to tap constructively social media. So it's not just a complaint space, but an organizing space. And they learned how to make constructive use out of that platform. And they also learned, as the year went on, as there were a series of other some promising moments, some disappointing moments for the students from their perspective, they also learned the power of sort of what I'll call tactical restraint, in the sense that the students could have been so angry. If you think back to the 1960s and 70s, they could have, thrown rocks at buildings. And that would have been the end of their protest from the administrative standpoint. It would have been very easy to sort of shut that thing down and punish people and all that sort of thing. No, they learned that the best way, and this is sort of their protest engagement, by being strategic, by being very savvy in the way they use evidence, the way they told stories, the way they rallied people around, that they painted the administration into corners on several occasions. Now, someone who writes about the post-emancipation African-American experience and teaches it was awfully impressed and really kind of proud of what they were doing. As the dean, I was horrified because it made my life so difficult. But they did learn how to be much more effective protesters. And one of the things I must say, going to social media, institutions like Yale move slowly. Even when they move quickly, it's slowly. And university administrations across the country are going to have to figure out some way to pick up pace. We will never, and should never move as quickly as the students. I don't think we should. But the students were running laps around us in terms of what we thought we could anticipate. And we thought we're going to go here to find them here, metaphorically speaking, and they'd be in another dimension, a whole other place. And we never saw it coming. And that was all through social media.
It is so striking to hear you describe this leap of faith, as you put it, that you saw some students making, that you were hoping students would make the leap or the pivot from protest, even well-honed protest, to more durable forms of the exercise of power and engagement. Yesterday, some of you might have been at this other panel that I was part of, in which DeRay McKesson, who's been one of the leading lights of the Black Lives Matter movement, was speaking. And one of the things that was interesting, and DeRay is himself an interesting figure within that movement, because he is not of the pure protest, the system is so sick, I don't want to engage it camp. He's a guy who actually ran unsuccessfully for mayor of Baltimore this year in the primary. He's a guy who's just taken a job now working in the Baltimore schools to try to bring in more diversity and inclusion into the administration of that system. So he is somebody who simultaneously is expert now at the theatricality of socially mediated and kind of in-person protests, whether it's been in Baltimore and Ferguson where he got started and other places, but is also willing and able to make that pivot into the system, right? I think one of the things that's fascinating about what you're describing here is that you're describing patterns that are true everywhere in American life right now,
Yes.
right? How that pivot happens, whether that pivot happens, whether various calls for revolution right now can get operationalized. And I think one of the things that is so striking to me about the way that you're talking is, even though you joke that you were horrified in your dean's capacity there, that there is, even in that capacity, you're hopeful that people can make that pivot and force you and the institution to change. One thing that strikes me, so this initiative that we've started at Yale College has activity throughout the year, but it has these punctuated moments at the beginning of each spring semester, this big convening where a lot of workshops and teaching and learning happen on different skills and dimensions of civic leadership. And we've had folks come in teaching about the art of organizing, teaching about using media to create and shape narrative, teaching about kind of connecting different parts of movements and building broader coalitions. And like I say, when we got this program started, it was prior to the unrest on campus. And so I'm interested in your thinking now as our initiative enters its third year, at the same time that the protests will now, and that movement on campus enters its second year. How do you see these things merging? Kind of, officially sanctioned efforts by the administration to teach the skills of leading in public, and many of those students who we are officially shaping and teaching in those settings will then immediately turn around and apply those learnings to pressure the administration to make changes that maybe the administration isn't willing or ready to make. In your role as a leader, how do you strike that balance or move on those things simultaneously?
It's a really good question. And I mean, the quick answer, and it's of course much more nuanced than that, is I'm all for it in the sense that we had a difficult year on campus. I don't want to have that kind of year ever again. It was extremely hard. But what I've come to conclude, and I really believe this, is that if our students didn't care about, in this case, Yale, if they didn't have a passion for what Yale promised them or what they believed Yale could be, and were disappointed by it, they wouldn't have done anything. And I'd much rather, as an individual, as a citizen, I'd much rather have students operating from a place of passion about trying to make something better. Now, as the dean, I might feel very differently. I could go for some really lazy, quiet, students. But the fact is, in my heart, I want them to be engaged and active citizens at Yale, because I know that's going to translate into being citizens of the world. Let me tell a quick story about these. We've now had 2 conferences as sort of the signature moment of this initiative. Both were in January, February. And in the first year, the adults ran the show, and we reached out to student organization leaders and had this, and ran all the logistics, and Eric brought in the speakers. It was a really great event. And at the end of that first day, we're meeting in an auditorium like this, and Eric was on the stage. I was sitting in the audience. I had to leave for a few hours to attend another Yale event as part of just my job as being the dean. So I didn't know how things had gone in the middle of the day. And Eric asks the students for their feedback. Like, I want to know how you felt this went. I was rather curious as well. And it just so happened the first person he calls on is sitting behind me. And I turn really quickly as Eric calls him, and this all happens within a flash. I turn and I see the young man with a scowl on his face. His eyebrows are, and I'm like, oh my goodness, the first piece of feedback is going to be negative. This is just not what you want. He said, I'm a senior, and I have to say I'm really angry because I've been waiting for 3.5 years for this to happen. And so this is all to Eric. I mean, this is really Eric's thing. And students they were from all over the place. And this student happened to be African-American male, but there were, of course, white students there, ethnic, racial groups across any way you can look at that, socioeconomic difference, naval ROTC, varsity athletes, conservative, liberal, you name it. I got up and told the students, like, this is great, I'm just inspired. I have the budget to make this happen again, but you have to be the ones to do it. And this is the point I'm leading up to, is that the students formed a steering committee, about 9 students, I think, 6 students, 9 students, and they set off to work. And these darn Yale students, I did have a budget. Well, they doubled the size of the event. I didn't have that much budget for it. I had to find the money to support it. And they have grown this through their, I was going to say organically, no, it's through their work. And this is exactly the kind of thing that we need to do, that I feel very comfortable as an administrator to say, these are some core ideals. These are some things that we should aspire to as being good citizens of the world. Let's build this thing together. And these students have started to do that. So I'm all, even if it makes my November filled with sleepless nights, because they're activated and they're saying, this is not satisfactory, you need to do better, I'd rather have that, that they are acting as engaged citizens at Yale, than to have them being somnolescent. I mean, I really would.
Well, one of the things that is so striking about the way that the students in this particular initiative have taken initiative, it's not only the kind of classic Deweyan idea of you got to learn by action, by doing, but it's also this, there's any of you who've been following higher ed over the last maybe couple of decades now know the ways in which particularly, well, I think it's across the board, but particularly at elite institutions like Yale, there's become this culture that I shorthand basically as gold star collection on steroids, right? Students get into places like Yale because they have just become, from an early age, often, you know, with the pushing and prompting of parents, incredibly adept at collecting gold star after gold star, right? And filling a resume and, you know, just having a record by the time they're 18 that frankly would put every one of us to shame, even as adults, right? People who, as they apply to Yale, have started global social ventures and have done this and that, and you know, and you look at it, and on the one hand, that's awesome, that's great. On the other hand, a lot of these students then arrive at a place like Yale, and though they've been incredibly expert at collecting gold stars and working systems that have you know, set up there, and kind of they figured out, oh, I see a system, I got to navigate the maze as fast as I can at the end, get my reward. That it's a different thing once you get to the more open-ended polity of a place like Yale College, and you get both the opportunity and the responsibility to be the co-creator of it, yes, and the co-author of it, yes, right? And that requires a different style of being and moving in the world, right? And a lot of the feedback we got from those students, both at the first time round and the second conference as well, was, you know, because they've been gold star collectors all their lives, they've gone to dozens of leadership conferences already, right? By the time they're 20 years old, it's like going to the gym, right? Because there's a proliferation of them responding to the gold star economy, and so they've been to a ton of these, and yet precious few of them have gone to the place that Jonathan started with when he talked about the very short job description of a head of one of the residential colleges, which is provide the moral and intellectual leadership, set the moral and intellectual tone, which requires in the first place to know your own moral and intellectual bearings, and to, once you become kind of fluent in your own bearings, to learn how to listen and engage with people who have moral and intellectual frameworks quite unlike your own, right? That's a form of both citizenship and leadership that that relatively few of these meritocratic superstars who arrive as undergraduates actually have, right? And that's so I'm zoom out from Yale and just thinking about this generation more broadly. How do we make this pivot and get off the gold star mode and more into the kind of from the inside out notion of I'm going to develop myself ethically as somebody who is worthy
Yep.
of leadership and catalytic roles.
Boy, you hit on, you and I could talk for hours on these issues, and hopefully the rest of you as well. One of the things that I think we need to do is we need to do a couple things. One, we need, as the people who are trying to pass things on to the next generation, help them understand the value of the word and the experience of the word no. That you can't get everything all the time, even if you're a gold star collector. It's not healthy, actually. I believe in an ethos of restraint, frankly. That I want to be able to ask. I certainly have asked the question myself a lot. I've been at Yale now for 17 years in a place of incredible abundance. And living in the head of a college lives in a mansion built into residential college, so like an ambassador's residence. So it's a weird thing for me to say it, coming from very wealthy place and very sumptuous residence when I lived there. We need to help a generation ask the question, when is enough enough? Like, just because you can, does that mean that you should? That's the restraint part about it. I think there's something really quite elegant about having the self-confidence that you know you can do X, Y, and Z, but you're going to do just X. You do X really, really well. And Y and Z, maybe someone else can do that really well, or maybe you can pitch in when Y and Z, we need help getting to Y and Z. But just because you can is not a sufficient reason to do something. I would much rather students at Yale, you wanted me to speak broadly, but I also live in my own little bubble. I'd much rather students at Yale be really great at 3 different things instead of trying to be great at 10. It's not a healthy way to live a life. And it doesn't force you to be focused long enough to get down deep into something where you can ask those questions. Should I be doing this? Is this enough? And these are students who are not going to slack off. So, you know, they'll be pushing no matter what. And just because I can, should I? To me, if we as a society ask those questions more often, it'd be much healthier.
Do you think saying no, having an ethic of restraint is very close to, it is a set of values that you're describing here.
Yes.
It's not only kind of tactical choices of, a seventh habit of how to, live an effective life. You're talking about something ethical here. And David Brooks, the New York Times columnist, teaches now a couple courses at Yale to undergraduates, and one of them is about kind of something he's shorthanded as resume virtues versus eulogy virtues, right? And I love that framing, right? Because I think a lot of our institutions, not of higher education, but frankly across the marketplace, focus on resume virtues. And you are touching on things that are ultimately more directed toward, not to sound more, morbid, but eulogy virtues, the idea of legacy, of sustainment, of things that are bigger than you, things that are beyond you, that therefore do require you to ask, what shall I focus on? How shall I say no to certain things? How do I align and work with others to make things happen, so that it's not just about kind of a self-promotion or aggrandizement, right?
And I don't want to be self-righteous and purer than thou, in the sense that I was a resume builder, and I worked very hard, and it's not like I just kind of decided one day I want to be the dean of Yale College, give it to me. I'd give it back now in cases. So there's hard work, there's conscientious stewardship of your own self in a professional way. Of course, we want to have those sort of things. But I just think the challenge is I work with young people who believe in an appropriate way that they are immortal, that bad things are never going to happen to them, that they can just do whatever they want to and it's going to work out. Well, there'll be a reckoning with that sense of immortality sooner or later for every single one of us, for one of them in particular. So I hadn't thought about it, resume building, was it resume?
Virtues.
Virtues and eulogy virtues. But the fact is, there's some basic golden rules that still apply. You can't take it with you. you know? The material things will give you some measure of comfort, sure, of course they will. But I don't think they bring you true pleasure. I don't. I mean, I like things, but at the end of the day, those things are not the reason I walk around. I've been asked numerous times this year if you thought, Jonathan, did you think, if you'd known what you're going to get into as the dean of the college, would you have done this sort of stuff? And of course, the flip answer is no, my gosh, I would not do this to myself. But the fact is, the answer is yes, I would. Because I love being around these young students who are energetic and certain they're going to change whatever the future is. That's what is rewarding, right?
So how has your own leadership style changed just in these 2 years of deanship?
Oh, gosh. That requires a level of self-awareness I may not possess. In the sense that, you know, the administration at Yale, we're all faculty. You know, I did not train up for this at all. I was a professor, was invited to head a residential college, was stepping down, was invited to become the dean of Yale College. I don't know that I could articulate what my leadership style is, except for that I listen to people. I will want to build a supportive environment. We all have egos, but I'm not driven by my ego in an inordinate kind of way, I don't think. I want to make the team I'm part of better. Maybe it's because I played team sports growing up. I don't know. It just brings me pleasure to see people around me succeed.
There's a notion, a term of art that many of you have heard that I think you're just describing right there, and that's servant leadership. And I think it is Robert Greenleaf, who's a writer and practitioner of leadership, kind of coined this not only phrase, but kind of an idea and a whole set of practices around how do you cultivate servant leadership, which is very different from either command leadership or ego-centered leadership or so forth. And what you just said, not only being part of a team, but you know, wanting to contribute to, be a steward of something that is both greater than you and shall outlast you.
Yes.
And you know, one of the things for any of you who've ever seen either the Yale campus or images of the campus, there's an iconic tower where the carillon is, the bell tower called Harkness Tower, and it's in most photographs of the college. And what most people, even most Yale students, don't know is that at the base of that tower, there are all these things carved and inscribed into the marble, some kind of images and icons. But there's a quote inscribed there by a member of the class of 1773, Nathan Hale, and it's his probably second most famous quote. His first most famous, of course, being, I regret that I have but one life to give for my country, the last words he uttered before he was hanged as a spy by the British during the Revolutionary War. But his second most famous quote, which is inscribed here, is simply this: "I wish to be useful." And to me, that is what Jonathan has just said, and kind of encapsulates a notion of leadership that is not self-directed or ego-driven, but is about servant leadership. But B is also, I think, part of what is in the air and literally kind of in the walls of an institution as both privileged and long-standing as Yale, that there is this sense of not noblesse oblige, but you should remember how ridiculously lucky you are to be walking a path here, and you better not hoard it.
That's right.
You better not hoard it and take everything, all the capital that you've earned and gained here for self and for glory. That your only charge here when you leave this joint is, figure out how to be useful. Your style of leadership, I would say, and I want to kind of pivot open to some either questions or comments here. As an alum of Yale College, but frankly, more importantly, just as somebody who works in the cultivation of powerful citizenship and civic leadership with communities all across this country that run the gamut from left to right, from poor to rich, for every demographic background and context you can imagine, that this style of leadership that Jonathan is both describing and practicing and trying to cultivate at the college is really only our country's way, is the only way forward for our country. It really is. And our political season right now is giving us lots of other forms and examples of leadership in public, but what Jonathan's describing and being is going to be vital. So let me open it up for anybody who might have some questions and comments. Yes, sir, in the hat. I can't. Got a mic coming.
Good morning, Dean. Good morning. In full candor, I'm a Yale graduate, class of '96. I'm also a civic educator, so these issues are very close to my heart. And also in full candor, I was the lead advance guy for Bernie Sanders. And I'm going to be part of the team implementing, hopefully, a peaceful platform at the convention. So pray for me in a couple weeks. My question is as follows. Okay. Gladly stand up. My question is as follows. You talked about patience and listening and being part of the system. How do you teach these skills, or what suggestions do you have for teaching these skills to youngsters, reminding them that they're part of a continuum and it's not just you, right? So yeah, it's good to agitate. Yeah, it's good to, put your name out there, have all these hashtags, but suppose you get what you want, then what?
That's a great question.
So
Yeah.
how do we equip youngsters and other people with that knowledge? Yeah, you made a protest. Yeah, you were on the front page of the New York Times. You got what you wanted. Now what?
That's great.
It's a great question. So at one point during our November our November moment on campus, I met with a group that was essentially spontaneously formed group of activists on campus. They had no leader, so trying to meet with them was actually quite a challenge. Didn't know who to talk to. By self-description, they had no leader. But I met with a group of them privately, and sort of off-the-record conversation. Like, I'm going to say some things you're not going to like. You'll say some things I won't like. But we're going to be honest with each other. And one of the things I talked about was essentially in that same spirit. I'm like, you have got our complete attention. You have done that. Now, how are you going to use that attention? So you may not, as I'm telling them this, you may not like what I have to say, but some of you need to stay on the outside. I get that. You need to agitate from the outside. But some of you need to come inside, or else, this is a moment in time where you might feel good about creating crisis, but will you have actually changed something? Because the administrations can wait students out. And enough of the issues that students were raising, the heartbreaking thing is that they are so consistent across time. They need to be changed. These issues need to be addressed. And we need them to get engaged on the inside, not try to get headlines, to do the actual work, the very mundane, not sexy work of just planning a program and a set of initiatives that's going to make structural change. The fact is, my term as dean is 5 years. In December, I'm halfway through that term. If I see the end of the 5 years, I will be kind of surprised. But I believe enough in the things that I'm doing that I want them to persist. It's not going to persist if the students don't help create structural change at the university. So that's that's internal to my world. But external, looking more broadly, we need to have authentic leaders who are going to listen and then do something. Listening is that's the potentially co-optive move, but they need to follow through. And part of the follow through is to get these activists, on whatever the issues are, to get into whatever an inner circle looks like given that context, to create structural changes. It's not about the change for tomorrow that's going to make you feel better. It's about the change that's going to take a year to have happen, or 2 years. But that will then become built into the system. So you don't have to agitate about that thing anymore.
Let's take at least one more. We've got a hand right there.
Okay, Michelle Kahana, and I'm from the New School. I'm Associate Dean for Educational Innovation and Social Engagement. a title I made up, but
It's a good one.
it's an actual title now. But in any case, what my question is, and it does build on this to some extent, is if we think civic leadership is so important and it's important to develop it early, how do we make it valued in a credentialed way? Right now, it's extracurricular. And so if, for example, we wanted to move from protest to actual work to make things happen and change, students at Yale do not have the time to actually, do that. They have a heavy course load. Is there a way to actually create the space where they actually get credit? And, then it sounds a little bit like they're being kind of co-opted. I understand that there's a risk there as well. But actually create this space with some supervision facilitated in some way and evaluated in some way. So that's one thing, is how do we actually make it not extracurricular, but part of the core curriculum? And the second thing is how do we credential civic leadership so it's understood by others as being something we not only value, but actually means something in the world?
We've just got a couple minutes left.
Yeah, I saw that. I don't know how to answer that question we have 2 minutes remaining. I don't know how to answer that question with 20 minutes remaining. Really good questions, though. Part of that is institutionally driven. Some institutions are much more open to an experimental, I don't mean this in a denigrating way, but an experimental curriculum. Yale's curriculum is at its core quite traditional liberal arts with struggles about how to change it sort of at the margins. I mean, my whole field is at the margins, so I recognize that tension. But, it's interesting about the credential thing, or student levels of energy or engagement. I don't have time to go into the story, but the students have really taken up a lot of other issues that Eric has floated during these sessions without asking for permission, without informing us even, that they're doing things. And in talking to alumni, some alums have been upset and sharing their unhappiness with me about all this. I'm being crude about it. They weren't this crude. All this diversity talk is distracting Yale from its educational mission. And I push back, I'm like, it is our educational mission. These students are Yale students. And the things they have to teach us are at the core of who we are. So I think a lot of the educational mission at an institution is going to be credentialed and non-credentialed. The administration has to take both seriously. So I don't know how to credential it. I do know how to take it seriously and to give resources to those students when they ask for them to build whatever program they're going to be building. I mean, that's been my answer.
I wish we had another 50 minutes to continue this conversation. I encourage you to check in with Jonathan both after this session and throughout the day as he's in other programs on campus. But I want to close just with both a sense of summation of our conversation here and maybe just a framework to take with us as we leave here, because not everybody here is the dean of a college, but everybody here is a civic educator. Even by your omissions and absences and choices not to act, you are a civic educator, and there are people all around you learning from your example all the time. And the two things that I want to kind of take away from this conversation, Jonathan spoke a fair amount in the first part about power, to the question earlier, about converting protest to durable power, about learning how to navigate systems of power, about learning when to challenge institutions and try to knock them over, and learning when to try to enter them and remake them. But the second piece that we spoke a fair amount about was character, ethics, values, right? Power alone does not make leadership or citizenship. It's power plus character. And I just want to close with this thought that, Jonathan's field, as he's mentioned a couple of times, post-emancipation African-American cultural and political history. When you think about, I know fairly recently, Jonathan just wrote the preface to a newly published edition of The Souls of Black Folk by W.B. Du Bois, the classic work. And actually, if you think about someone like Du Bois, who, to my knowledge, never had a traditional title of civic leadership. He was certainly never in political office. He was a leader in the early NAACP and certainly in activist movements. But he was a person who, number one, was willing to kind of challenge that gap between ideas and institutions that Jonathan described, and write about it and challenge the conscience of people. But then number two, was willing to do something about it by agitating, by pushing systems, by challenging people in and out of those systems. And Jonathan and I, as we've gotten to know each other, and I've always been conscious of this field of work of his, I'm conscious of these templates, these exemplars, these models that we have. And you can choose a Du Bois. You can choose those of you who heard Brian Stevenson speak yesterday afternoon in the afternoon of conversation, you can choose someone living like Brian Stevenson. You can choose Jonathan Holloway. But it's our task as we're moving forward in the world as civic educators to assemble this repertoire of exemplars, living and not living, from all these different domains, and cobble together our own spirit of leadership that's for a greater good. And I can think of no better person to have in that repertoire than my friend Jonathan, and I hope you'll join me in thanking him for being with us today.
Thank you. Thank you.